I've met lots of people who I don't know, you should crawl out of the 16th century. That's more cruel than they are. And I've got tricks up my sleeve that they cannot even possibly imagine. And if they irritate me, same thing. And that chaos, that presupposition, but it's not like it just came out of nowhere. It took and this is something else Nietzsche observed so interestingly. And he said, you know, that a moral revelation was the consequence of a tremendously... What that means, as far as I can tell, is that there's a recognition there in the image that the person who's most dominant is the one who's, or has the most authority of a second from catastrophe. They're pushing themselves farther than they've ever gone in the act morally is not to win today's contest at the expense of the rest of possible contests. And again, I don't see that as something that's arbitrary. It's not relativistic. There's an absolute moral stance there, and everyone recognizes it. And I also think it's the key to success. And I would also say it's very much akin, in a strange way, like the person who is the master at being invited to play the largest possible number of games is also the same person. I haven't quite figured out the precise relationship between these two, is also the same person that goes out forthrightly to conquer the unknown before it presents itself as the enemy at the door. They're the same thing. Now, I haven't figured out why that is exactly, but well, I'll figure it out eventually. When I do, I'll tell you, if you're interested. So, okay, so here's some other ideas of God as hierarchical authority figure. So strip the religious preconceptions off what you observe and just look at what you see. Well, look, there's primate looking upwards at dominant figure. That's what you see there. Now, it's very interestingly symbolically represented because you have God the Father there with the cross. And I think what that means, as far as I can tell, is that there's a recognition there in the image that the person who's most dominant is the one has the most authority, is the one who's voluntarily accepted the suffering that's part of being. And that's what that picture represents. It's like the authority holds that and says, this is what you have to accept. And that transfixes the viewer because of the fact that it's true. And you think, well, is that true? Okay, well, think about it this way. Do you like brave people or do you like cowards? Well, that's pretty straightforward. And what's the ultimate act of bravery? It's to come to terms with the fact that you're mortal and limited, and to live forthrightly regardless. Well, obviously, that's at the core of what's admirable. And why would we presume that that's not the case? We act as if that's the case. It's what everyone dreams and wishes that they could do. I mean, assuming that, you know, you dispensed with the idea that you're going to be immortal, I suppose that might be worth wishing for too, or perhaps not. Immortal is a very long time. But you certainly want this, and that image says, well, this is what you should be. And you know, we've got that same opening into the sky going on in that image that I showed you before. It's like this is a transcendent truth that constantly remanifests itself across time and space. And Jung would say, it's built into your psyche, that image. Now, you know, there are elements of it that are culturally constructed. It wouldn't necessarily have to be the cross, although the cross is a very old symbol. It's far older than its use in Christianity, and it's been used in many, many religious representations. But that echoes, the soul echoes with that, you know, and well, and then there's Moses up there on the mount receiving the law. So we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to Exodus. But if we get to Exodus. So, well, look, where does it happen? Well, on a mountain. Well, that's a pyramid. That's up, right? That's up. It's up. It's up in the stratosphere. It's up in the sky where you look upward. Okay, and then so what's happening to Moses? Well, here's a bit of a clue, as far as I can tell. I figured this out partly again by reading Jean Piaget, because one of the things that Piaget said about kids was that They first learn to play a game, but they don't know what the rules are. Meaning that if you have a bunch of kids together, they can play a game, but if you take one of the kids out of the game when they're young, say 6, and you say what are the rules, they can only sort of give you a representation. So you take 6-year-old 1 and he'll tell you some of the rules, and 6-year-old 2 will tell you different rules, and 6-year-old 3 will tell you different rules. But if you put them all together, they can play. So they have the knowledge embodied either individually or in the group. The knowledge is there to be extracted. Well, then they get a little older, they can extract the rules. And then they start to play by the rules. And then Piaget's last step was, well, it isn't just the kids play by the rules, it's that they learn that they can make the rules. And he thought about that as moral progression. First you can play, then you can play by the rules. Then you learn, maybe, because he didn't think everyone learned this, that you're actually the master of the rules. That doesn't mean the rules are arbitrary, but it means that you can be the generator of the rules, assuming that you know how to play the game. And he thought about that as a moral progression. And then I thought, well, that's exactly what happened to Moses in the story of Exodus, because Moses is out there leading all those Israelites around, and like, they don't have a law, they don't have a lawgiver, they have a tradition. They're all like crabby because, well, they're in a desert. It's like, they were in a tyranny, but now they're in a desert. It's like, that's no improvement. So they're really getting pretty bitchy about it. And so they're worshiping false idols and having one catastrophe after another. And they get Moses to judge their conflicts. And so he does that for God only knows how long. Forever. Crabby Israelites come to Moses and bitch at him. It's like, well, he did this and she did that. And so then he has to figure out how to make peace. And he does that so long that one of his, I think it's his father-in-law, tells him he has to stop doing it because he's going to exhaust himself. Well, then you think, well, what's happening? Well, and I'm not assuming that this is like a literal historical story. I think, again, it's a condensation. Well, any group has a set of customs, just like a wolf pack does. And so then the customs are being manifest, and someone who's a genius is watching and thinking, okay, well, what's the rule in this situation? What's the rule in this situation? What's the rule in this situation? And then in his imagination, the rules turn into a hierarchy, and then he goes up on the mountain and he goes bang, and he thinks, oh my God, here's the rules that we've been living by all this time. And that's the revelation of the commandments. Well, and you think, well, how else could it be? You think the rules came first and obeying them came second? It's like, no, the rules come first. Sorry, the actions come first. The obeying them comes first. And then you figure out what everybody's up to, and you say, hey, look, this is what you've been up to all along. And everybody goes, oh, yeah, that seems to make sense. And if it didn't, who would follow them? No one was going to follow them if they don't match what's already there. You just think about that as unjust. And so that's portrayed here as a cataclysmic human event. It's like, oh my God, we've been chimpanzees, we've been in this hierarchy of authority for so long, we have no idea what we're doing, and all of a sudden, poof, it burst into revelatory consciousness, and we could say, here is the law. And you say, well, is it given by God? Well, hey, it depends on what you mean by God. I could start with that presupposition, but it's not like it just came out of nowhere. It took and this is something else Nietzsche observed so interestingly, and he said, you know, that a moral revelation was the consequence of a tremendously long process of initial construction and then formulation. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of custom, of building custom, before you get the revelation of the articulated law. And that's a description of the pattern that works. And let's say, well, what's the pattern that works? It's the game that you can play with everybody else day after day with no degeneration. And that's another thing Piaget figured out that's so brilliant, and that's his idea of the equilibrated state. It's an extension of Immanuel Kant's idea about the universal maxim, right? Act in a way so that each action could become a universal rule. That was Kant's fundamental moral maxim, and Piaget put a twist on that. He said, no, that's not exactly it. It's act in such a way that it works for you now, and next week, and next month, and next year, and 10 years from now. And so that while it's working for you, it's also working for the people around you and for the broader society. And that's the equilibrated state. And you could think about that as an intimation of the kingdom of the city of God on earth, something like that. And it's based on this idea that a morality has to be iterable. And you know, there's lots of there's been lots of simulations online already, artificial intelligence simulations of trading games, right? I mean, the people who've been studying the emergence of moral behavior, say in artificial intelligence systems, have already caught on to the idea that one of the crucial elements to the analysis of morality is iterability. You can't play a degenerating game because it degenerates. Like, obviously, you want to play a game that at least remains stable across time. And God, if you could really get your act together, maybe it would slowly get better. And of course, that's what you'd hope for your family, right? That's what you're always trying to do, unless you're completely hell-bent on revenge and destruction. It's like, is there a way that we can continue to play together that will make playing together even better the next day? That's what you're up to. And well, I don't see anything arbitrary about that. And part of it, and this is also why I think that bloody postmodernists are so incorrect, because, you know, they say something like, there's an infinite number of interpretations of the world, and that's actually true. But then they make a mistake, and they say, well, no interpretation is to be privileged over any other interpretation. It's like, wrong, wrong. That's where things go seriously off the rails, because the interpretation has to be, and this is the Piagetian objection, is like, if you and I are going to play a game, rule one is we both have to want to play. Rule two is other people are going to let us play. Rule three is we should be able to play it across a pretty long period of time without it degenerating. And maybe rule four is, while we're playing, the world shouldn't kill us. It's like there are not very many games, like you don't send your kids out to play on the superhighway, right? So they're not playing hockey on the superhighway because the world kills them. And so there's an infinite number of interpretations, but there is not an infinite number of solutions. And the solutions are constrained by the fact of the world and our suffering in the world, and then also constrained by the fact that we constrain each other. And so that's where I think that's gone like dreadfully, dreadfully wrong. So, it's really fun to look at these old pictures once you kind of know what they mean. You know, at least that's what I've discovered, is that once I kind of understand the underlying rationale for, I mean, someone worked hard on that. That's an engraving, right? They took a long time making that picture. They're serious about it. And when you understand what it means, you know, all those people, they're prostrate at the revelation of the law. It's like, well, no wonder. It's like, break the law and see what happens. Break the universal moral law, man, and see what happens. You know, I see people in that situation, well, as you all do all the time, perhaps me more than you because I'm a clinical psychologist, you know, and if the people I'm seeing haven't broken the universal law, then you can bloody well be sure that people around you have. It's no joke. Like, you make a mistake and things will go seriously wrong for you. And so, it's no wonder that you'd be terrified at the revelation of the structure that governs our being. One of the things that's so remarkable about the Old Testament, this is another thing Nietzsche commented on. He was a real admirer of the Old Testament, not so much of the New Testament. He thought it was a sin for Europe to have glued the New Testament onto the Old Testament, because he thought the Old Testament was a really accurate representation of the phenomenology of being. It's like, stay awake, speak properly, be honest, or watch the hell out. Because things will come your way that you just do not want to see at all. And it might not just be you, it might be everyone you know and everything about your culture that is demolished for generation after generation. It's like, stay awake and be careful. And I think that people only don't believe that when they're being hubristic. And I think that most people know that deep in their hearts. You know, when you get high on your horse, that happens fairly often. If you have any sense, you think, geez, I better be careful and tap myself down a fair bit, because if I get too puffed up, man, something's going to come along and take me out at the knees. And everyone knows that. Pride comes before a fall. It's like, if you have any, that's why it says in the Old Testament that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It's like, I've never, in all my years as a clinical psychologist, and this is something that really does terrify me, I have never seen anyone ever get away with anything at all, even once. You know, there's that old idea that God has a book, you know, and keeps track of everything in heaven. It's like, okay, you know, maybe it's not a book. Fine. But that is a really useful thing to think about, because, well, maybe you disagree. Maybe you think people get away with things all the time. I tell you, I've never seen it. What I see instead is that thing happens, right? Someone twists the fabric of reality. And they do it successfully because it doesn't snap back at them that moment. And then like 2 years later, something unravels and they get walloped and they think, oh my God, that's so unfair. And then we track it. It's like, well, what happened before that? This. Well, and then what? This. And then what? This. And then what? Oh, this. Oh, that's where it went wrong. It's, yeah, because you can't twist the fabric of reality without having it snap back. It doesn't work that way, and why would it? Because what are you going to do? Twist the fabric of reality? I don't think so. I think it's bigger than you. You know, and I think that one of the things that really tempts people is the idea that, well, I can get away with it. It's like, yeah, you try. You see how well that works. It's like you get away with nothing. And that is the beginning of wisdom. And it's something that deeply terrifies me. And, you know, ever since last September, when I came to more like broader public attention, one of the things I've been terrified of making a mistake, because I certainly know I'm more than capable of making a mistake. Thank God so far either I haven't made one or no one's found out about it. So, but it's like, you know, we walk on a very thin and narrow edge, and we're very lucky when things aren't degenerating into chaos around us or rapidly moving to far too much order. And it's not an easy thing to stay on that line. And you can tell when you're on that line because the things are deeply meaningful and engaging when you're on that line. But if you're not existentially terrified about the consequences of wavering off that, then you are truly not awake. So, and that's what I see in this picture. You know, it's like, look out, man. Because there are rules. And if you break them, God help you. So one of the things that seems to me the case with regard, I mentioned this in the question period a bit last time, is that one of the things that seems to be actually one of the advantages to gluing the New Testament onto the Old Testament is the idea of a transformation in morality that is analogous to the Piagetian idea that after you learn to play by the rules, you can learn to make the rules, because I think that's actually what happens to some degree in the transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because in the Old Testament, most morality is prohibition. Here are things you shouldn't do. It's like, you know, fair enough. And that's a lot of what you do with your kids. Don't do this, don't do this, don't. Especially when they're happy, you're always going around telling them to stop being so happy, because all they're doing is causing trouble. It's quite painful if you're a parent and you notice that. But the first morality is prohibition, right? Control yourself so that you don't cause too much trouble. And then maybe if you get that down and you're good at it, then the next thing is, well, once you're disciplined, then you can start working towards something that's a positive good. And that's the transformation that seems to me to be fundamentally characteristic of the juxtaposition of the New Testament onto the Old Testament. But in these images, it's still something like serve tradition, serve the Father, psychologically speaking. Support the tradition, because you live on it. There, in an old Mesopotamian story, the Enuma Elish, which you can read about if you're interested in, the original gods, who are really badly behaved, they're like 2-year-olds. In fact, they're a lot like 2-year-olds. They kill the primordial god, Apsu, who's the patriarchal god. They kill him and try to live on his corpse. Well, that's what we all do, right? Because we live on the corpse of our ancestors. You could say, live on the corpse of our culture. It's dead. And that's not a great place to live, so you have to keep revivifying it so the damn thing, you know, stays active and awake. You stay on the corpse for too long, and then the devil or the demon of chaos comes back, and that's what happens in the Mesopotamian story. It's like, don't be thinking that you can stay on the corpse of your ancestors for too long without contributing to the revivification of the system. Because the chaos that all of that holds at bay will definitely come and visit you. And you see that in stories like The Hobbit. You know, hobbits, they're nice, they like to eat, they're kind of fat, they're short, they're not very bright, you know, they're hubristic. They have no idea what's out there in the broader world. They're protected, if you remember, by the Striders, who are the sons of great kings, who look like tramps. They have nothing but contempt for them. They patrol the borders and keep the bloody hobbits safe. But out there in the periphery, all hell is brewing and chaos is generating and forming. And that's an archetypal story, and that's why people like that story so much. Because that's exactly right. Like, we're the hobbits, and we are protected from chaos by the spirits of our dead ancestors, and we're too damn stupid to know it. and we think, oh, well, we don't need them anymore. And that, to me, that's postmodernism. That's what the bloody universities are doing with the humanities. It's absolutely appalling. And we will pay for it. So, unless we wake up, and hopefully we'll wake up, because that would be better than paying for it, even though being awake is rather painful. So then I had this vision one time, and I kind of portrayed it in this image of what the world was like. And I thought, well, it's not a pyramid. It's not a single hierarchy of authority. That's not what it is. It's an array of hierarchies of authority. So you imagine this sort of infinite plane. And in the infinite plane, there's nothing but pyramids. And inside the pyramids, there are strata of people everywhere, as far as you can look. Some of the pyramids are tall, some of them are short, they overlap. It's endless, the plane is endless, and those are all the positions to which you could rise. And everybody's inside the pyramid, sort of crammed up, trying to move towards the top. And then there's the possibility of sailing across over top of all of them and seeing how the structure itself works. And that's the eye that floats above the pyramid and that sees the structure itself. And the highest order of being is not to be at the top of the pyramid. It's to use the discipline that you attain by striving towards the top of the pyramid to release yourself from the pyramid and move one step up. And I think that's one of the things that's instantiated in the idea of for example, of the Holy Ghost. So, and I think that's akin to that. That's Sisyphus. And Nietzsche said of Sisyphus, if I remember correctly, that one has to imagine him happy. Well, if there's a rock at the bottom of the hill, then you might as well push it up the hill. And if it rolls back down, well, then you've got something else to do, don't you? To push the damn rock back up the hill. And there's no shortage of rocks to push up the hill, and that's what we're built for anyways. And so let's go out and like push some damn boulders up the hill, and then maybe we could have enough self-confidence and enough respect for ourselves that we wouldn't have to turn to hatred and revenge and try to take everything down, because I think that's the alternative. So he's not weak. That's one thing you could say about him. The same idea represented there, right? That's Atlas, who voluntarily takes the world on his shoulders. It's like the idea of Christ taking the sins of the world on his shoulders. It's exactly the same notion, which is the notion that you should be able to recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity and take responsibility for it, because that's what that means. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that if you can recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity, you will instantly have a hell of a lot more respect for yourself than you did before you did that. Because there's some real utility in knowing that you're a monster. Now, and just because you're a monster doesn't mean you have to be a monster, but it's really useful to know that you are one. So, one of the things that Jung knew, and this is something that I find so amazing about his writings, and I think something that really distinguishes him, for example, from Joseph Campbell, who talked about following your bliss, is like Jung said very clearly that the first step to enlightenment is the encounter with the shadow. And what he meant by that was, everything horrible that human beings have done was done by human beings, and you're one of them. And so if you don't understand that, and to understand that really means to know how it was that you could have done it, and that's a shattering thing, to try to imagine that, to try to imagine yourself as someone who's engaged in medieval torture, to see how you could in fact do that. You're never the same after you learn that. But being never the same after learning that is unbelievably useful, because when you understand that that's what you're like, then you're a whole different creature. And I don't think, and this is something I did learn from Jung, is that you cannot be a good person until you know how much evil you contain within you. It is not possible. And it's partly because you just don't have any potency. Like, if you're just naive, if you're just nice, if you'd never hurt anyone, you'd never hurt a fly, you don't have the capability for any of that, why would anyone ever take you seriously? You're a domestic animal at best, you know, and a rather contemptible one at that. And it's a very strange thing, because you wouldn't think that the revelation of the capacity for evil is a precondition for the realization of good. But I believe, first of all, why would you be serious enough to even attempt to pursue the good unless you had some sense of what the consequence was of not doing it? You have to be serious about these sorts of things. It's not the game of a child, right? It's the game of a fully developed adult. And I learned this in part when I had little kids. I wrote a chapter from my new book called Never Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And why was that? And I wrote that after I knew I was a monster. And I thought, I'm going to make sure I like my kids. I'm going to make sure they behave around me so that I like them, because I'm way bigger than them. And I'm way more cruel than they are. And I've got tricks up my sleeve that they cannot even possibly imagine. And if they irritate me, I will absolutely take it out on them. And if you don't think that you're the sort of person that would do that, then you are the sort of person who is doing it. You know, we're not going to get to Adam and Eve, haha. I watched this great documentary once called Hitman Hart. It was about Bret Hart, who was the most famous Canadian in the world for a while. And he was a Worldwide Wrestling Federation wrestler, you know. And he was a good guy. And he came from this famous family of wrestlers who all came from Alberta. I think there were 7 brothers who were wrestlers and 7 sisters, and all the sisters married wrestlers. And they were all offspring, children of Stu Hart, who was a wrestling impresario like 40 years ago. And it was such a cool documentary because I was always wondering, why in the world do people watch wrestling and believe it, you know? Believe it. Do you believe movies when you go watch them? It's like, that's a hard question to answer. Well, you're there, you do. And so if you're watching wrestling and you're a wrestling fan, do you believe it? Well, it isn't a matter of belief, it's a matter of being engaged in a drama. And there are different levels of drama, right? So let's say Worldwide Wrestling Federation drama is not the most sophisticated form of drama. Okay, but I'm not being a smart aleck when I'm saying that. There is drama of different sophistication for different people. And that's also why religious truths exist at multiple levels simultaneously, right? There's got to be something in it for everyone. And that's a hard belief system. That's a hard system to put together. Something for the unbelievably sophisticated and something for the common person. Okay, so we have wrestling, and Bret Hart was a good guy, and he fell into the archetype of being a good guy, and that's partly what the story's about. It was a bit too much for him. But one of the things that he laid out so carefully was because he figured that 120 million people knew him, something like that. And that everywhere he went, he was treated like a hero. And he found that quite a burden, as you can imagine, if you think about it. But he portrayed what was happening in the wrestling ring as classic good against evil. But not conceptualized and discussed, right? Embodied, fought out, acted out. Like Thor and the Hulk, except like right in front of you. And so, well, that's exactly this sort of thing. I mean, we could consider hockey more sophisticated than wrestling, perhaps. And as I said, I'm not being a critic of these. I'm not being critically minded about these things. I understand their purpose, and I would highly recommend that documentary. It's a brilliant documentary. But it's the same thing. Silver Cup, right? It's like, there's the hero of the team. That's the hero of the teams. You know, here's something cool. If you're the fan of the Toronto Blue Jays, or the Toronto Maple Leafs, of course this hardly ever happens to you if you're the fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs, because they always lose. But if you're watching a game and your team wins and we take your testosterone levels, then they went up. And if you watch the Toronto Maple Leafs and they lost and you're a fan, then your testosterone levels go down. So that's pretty damn funny, you know? I mean, really, don't you see how deeply instantiated this is in people? I mean, it bloody well alters your biochemistry, like your testosterone levels. It's all, oh, my team lost. You know, it's like, there'll be nothing in it for the wife tonight, you know, so. Well, this is the cosmos, I think, from the phenomenological perspective. One of the things that has come to my realization is that this is real. This is real. It's not a metaphor. It's way deeper than a metaphor. The most real things about life are the place you don't know and the place you know. And you could say, well, that's explored territory and unexplored territory. That's real, and it's been around forever. Back to the lobsters. You know, if you put lobsters in a new place, the first thing they do is go around their territory, finding places to hide, and also making a burrow. So the first thing they do is establish what they know, against what they don't know. And that's real. It's real from the Darwinian perspective. And we're going to say that what's real from the Darwinian perspective is plenty real enough. Because we're alive and everything, and so that sort of thing matters. It's like, well, that's what this is, the Taoist symbol. That's what it says. Is the what it says, what is experience made of? Eternally. It's easy. Chaos and order. And in every bit of chaos, there's the possibility of order. And in every bit of order, there's the possibility of chaos. And that's the way, right? That's the path of life. That's life itself. And where you're supposed to be is right on the border between the two of those. And why is that? Stable enough, engaged enough, right? So not only are you doing what you should be doing, you're doing it in a way that increases the probability that you'll do it better tomorrow. And you can tell when you're doing that because you're engaged. You're in the right time and place. And your neurology tells you that. That's what meaning is. That's what transcendent meaning is. And that's so cool because I also think that that is the antidote to existential suffering. The antidote to existential suffering is to be at the right place at the right time. And you know, you want to get technical about it. Okay, anxiety and pain. That's the reality of existential suffering. Okay, so let's say you're in the right place at the right time. What happens to you biochemically? Dopaminergic activation. What does that do? Suppresses anxiety, and it's analgesic. Now, it's more than that because it also produces positive emotion and the desire to move forward, and it underlies creativity. And so not only do you get the positive engagement from a neurochemical perspective, you get the analgesia, and you get the and you get the reduction of anxiety. So it's not hypothetical, and it is the case that the dopaminergic systems, those are the exploratory systems, unbelievably ancient and archaic, are activated when you're optimally positioned to be incorporating new information, which is what human beings do, because we're information foragers. And so we want to be secure, but building on our security at the same time. And then we want to do it for ourselves, we want to do it for other people, we want to do it for our families, we want to do it for broader society. We want to bring the whole world together in alignment to do that, and that's meaningful. And God only knows what we could do about the suffering of the world if we did that. You know, we have no idea what we could do if we started doing things properly. And maybe so many of the things that dismay us about life, we could stop. I mean, we stopped a lot of them in the last 100 years. You know, things are a lot better than they were 100 years ago. Obviously, they're not perfect. But 100 years ago, 120 years ago, man, you know, the average person in the Western world lived on less than $1 a day in today's dollars. It's like, you just try that for a week and see how much fun that is. So, the Taoists, well, what is this? Well, this is the pre-cosmogonic chaos out of which the Word of God extracted habitable order at the beginning of time. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And that chaos, we'll talk a bit more about that later, I guess, because it's a very complicated thing to describe. But it's certainly the thing that when you encounter, the chaos is what you encounter when the Twin Towers fall. Right? You remember what that was like, right? So it was September 10th. Well, that was the world. Everyone knew what the world was like. And then it was September 11th, and everyone walked around dazed for 3 days because the buildings fell. But so what? You can see a building fall. You can understand what happens when a building falls. So then what's going on with the being dazed? Well, it's the chaos that underlies our habitable order manifested itself when those buildings collapsed. It was a brilliant act of terrorism. And everyone was frozen and curious because that's how we react to that sort of thing. It's like the shark. You know, remember that famous movie poster for Jaws with the woman swimming on the top underneath, coming up to take her out. Well, that's life, man. That's the world. And now and then you see that. And when something falls like the Twin Towers fall, you remember that the ocean below you, the abyss, right, the primordial abyss, that bloody thing is deep. And you're fragile. And that happens when someone betrays you, and it happens to you when your dreams fall apart. You encounter that chaos again from which the world is extracted, and then you're called upon to act out attention and the word in order to bring the world back into order. And none of that is superstitious. None of that is superstitious. None of that's even metaphorical. It's real. It's more real than anything else. And I think the reason for that in part is that it's been this way forever. Right? As long as there's been life. This has been the rule of life. And that's the cosmos, that's reality, that's what we inhabit. And so, one of the things, you know, the so-called new atheists, and I don't want to go on a tangent about new atheists, because I think atheists are often remarkably honest and very consistent in their analysis. So, but I just don't think they're taking the problem seriously. I don't think they take their evolutionary theorizing nearly with the seriousness that it necessitates. And I don't think that you can dispute the proposition that the longer something has had a selection effect on life, the more real it is. It's the fundamental axiom of Darwinian biology. And I think the Darwinian world is more real than the physical world. That was the argument that I was trying to have with Sam Harris, and I didn't do the world's best job of that, although it went not too bad the second time. But it's not something to be taken lightly. It's a very serious, profound, and meaningful proposition. And people act it out and want to act it out whether they know it or not. That's Marduk. So the story of Marduk, I'll just give it to you very briefly. Tiamat and Apsu are locked in embrace at the beginning of time. Goddess of salt water, god of fresh water, together. Chaos and order. Right? They give rise, masculine and feminine, they give rise to the world of the elder gods. And those are, to me, they're primordial motivational forces. They're something like that. And their rage and their lust and their love and all these things that possess us that are there forever. And they're out in the world acting. And they carelessly slay Apsu, their father. And they're making a racket, and then they kill Apsu. And then Tiamat gets wind of that. And that's Tiamat right there, by the way. Kind of a rough-looking creature. And she's the mother of all things. And so she's not very happy about this. Her children have destroyed structure itself. Plus they're noisy and careless. And so she thinks, all right, just like Noah, just like the God that brings the flood to Noah. Exactly the same idea. Tiamat comes back and says, yeah, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to take you out. And she makes this battalion of monsters and puts the worst monster there is at the head of the battalion. His name is Kingu. He's like a precursor to the idea of Satan. And she lets the gods know, hey, I'm coming for you. And so they're not very happy about this because they're gods, but like, yeah, she's chaos itself, right? She gave birth to everything. This is no joke. And so they send one god out after another to confront her, and they all come back with their tails between their legs. There's no hope. And then one day there's a new god that emerges, and that's Marduk. And the gods know, as soon as he pops up, they know he's something new. Remember, and this is happening while the Mesopotamians are assembling themselves, one of the world's first-rate civilizations. So all the gods of all those tribes are coming together to organize themselves into a hierarchy to figure out what proposition rules everything. And so Marduk is elected by all the gods, and he says, look, I'll go out there and I'll take on Tiamat, but here's the rule. From here on, you follow me. I determine destiny. I'm the top god. I'm the thing at the top of the hierarchy. And all the other gods say, hey, look, no problem. You get rid of chaos, we do exactly what you say. And Marduk, he has eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. Those are his primary attributes. And so he takes a net, and he goes out to confront Tiamat. And he encloses her in a net, which I think is so cool because it's an encapsulation, right? It's a conceptual encapsulation. He encloses chaos itself in a conceptual structure. He puts it in a net, and then he cuts her into pieces. And he makes the world. And then he creates human beings to inhabit that world. He creates human beings out of blood, the worst of humans. And that took me, Colin DeYoung, who's a student of mine, helped me figure that out. I thought, is that pessimistic? You know, what exactly? It's like a fall metaphor. It's like the idea of original sin, but our joint conclusion with regards to that was that human beings are the only creatures in creation that can truly deceive. Right? We have the capacity for evil, just like it says in the Adam and Eve story. We can actually do that, and that's why we're made out of the blood of Kingu, the king of the demons. We are the thing that can deceive, that can twist the structure of reality. Well, so Marduk. Now, the Mesopotamians had an emperor, right? And the emperor was the avatar of Marduk. That's what made him emperor. He was only an emperor if he was going to be Marduk. He had to be a good Marduk, which meant he had to confront Tiamat, chaos, and cut her up and make order out of her pieces. And what the Mesopotamians used to do at the New Year's celebration, they'd go outside their walled city, and that's explored territory versus unexplored territory. They'd go outside their walled city into chaos, and they'd bring all the statues that represented the gods, and they'd act this out. Because they're trying to figure something out, right? They're trying to figure out what this means. They're acting it out. And then they'd take their emperor, and the priest would make him kneel, and they'd take all his king uniform off, his emperor uniform off, and make him kneel and humiliate him and nail him with a glove and say, okay, how were you not a good Marduk this year, right? And then he'd recount all the ways that he was inadequate in confronting chaos, and then they'd do the celebration, and Marduk would win, and the king would go sleep with a royal prostitute. The reason for that was, it's the same idea as St. George pulling the virgin from the dragon. It's exactly the same idea, that if you encounter the reptilian chaos, you can extract something out of it with which, if you unite, you produce creative order. That's what they were acting out. And that was the basis for the Mesopotamian idea of sovereignty. It's so smart. It's so unbelievably smart. And, you know, the Mesopotamians had a massive influence on the civilizations that then had a massive influence on us. It's one of the stories of how the notion of sovereignty itself came to be. It's the evolution of the idea of God. That's one way of thinking about it. But even more importantly, it's the evolution of the idea of the redemptive human being, right? And that's taken to one of its conclusions, well, in the story of Buddha, but also in the story of Christ, the idea of the perfect individual. And the notion is, well, that's the word that speaks truth into chaos at the beginning of time to generate habitable order that is good. That's the story. And so with that, I'll just show you these pictures because they're so interesting. Once you know what they mean, they're so cool. That's a symbol of infinity. That's Hercules and the Hydra. What's life like? Cut off one head. What happens? 7 more grow, right? Well, what do? Run home? Well, no, that's not what you do. This is what you do. You fight it. It's the chaos that generates partial chaos. It's the ultimate chaos that generates partial chaos. But that chaos also is what revivifies life, because otherwise it would just be static. Mercury, the head of the Hydra, right? Freezes you. That's St. George. He's doing it peacefully, which is so interesting, right? He's got a beatific look on his face in that particular representation. Another St. George, right? The Virgin in the background. I think that's St. Anne, if I remember correctly. St. George, he's the patron saint of England. Here's an interesting one. This actually sheds light on the human proclivity for warfare. St. George, that's a Muslim soldier. It's really easy to transform the enemy into the dragon, right? Because the enemy is often the predator, and we do that instantaneously, right? Without a second thought. And so then we can go to war morally, because why not take out the snakes? Well, you know, the problem is, where are the snakes? Well, maybe they're outside, and maybe they're not. Maybe they're in this room, and even worse, maybe they're in you. And that's wisdom, when you know that they're in you. Why wouldn't she be happy about that? Especially if she had a child, right? Seriously. And that's Horus, right? The god of vision. And he was a falcon, because falcons have great vision. They fly above everything and they can see everything. So that was the Egyptian creator god, Horus. And I'll tell you the story about Horus at some point as well. Now here's some pictures that demonstrate what I had described as the emergence of, let's say, the meta-hero out of the hero. So there's the person you admire, and then there's the set of people that you admire, and then there's the meta set of admirable people, and the extraction of that ideal. As far as I can tell, that's just what's portrayed in these images. That's a great one. It's a very sophisticated image. You see the two sides of Christ's face are not symmetrical. One's God and one's man. That's what that icon means. And so the fully developed person in this representation is one of the oldest representations of this sort that we know. The idea is that there's the human person in his ordinariness, let's say, and then there's this kinship with the divine that's associated with the willing adoption of the responsibility of mortal being. And that produces this union, and then it's manifest in a book, right? Because that's speech, and it's associated with the sun, right? It's the proper way of being. And that's a perfect example, I think, of the emergence of the archetype out of the multitude. That's what it looks like to me. And so, I guess now we're done with Genesis 1, and that took 3 lectures, but God's complicated, you know? That's the thing. So, thank you, and next week, by all appearances, that's where we are. So, we've got 20 minutes for questions.
So, in the past, I've done some work with Big Brother, Big Sister, and whatever. That being said, the most common story I tend to hear from conflicted youth is that they're raised in a single-family home, usually with a mom. Dad is either on the picture, an alcoholic, whatever. So we have this child who is trying to seek ways to make himself healthy and empower himself in the ways that a healthy father should have done so, you know, between the formative years of like 1 to 4. So I think you know where I'm going with this. Let's say for someone who's born without like a good father figure, where would they go out in the world, or like what spheres of influence would they try to expose themselves to like gain access to that fountain of health and knowledge that a good father figure should have provided them to in the first place?
Okay, well, partly, I mean, certainly to some degree, a good mother can provide that, right? To some degree. Although it's hard for one person to be everything.
Right.
You know, and I think one of the conundrums that face women, and this is a tough one, and this is why I think women are higher in trait agreeableness and higher in trait negative emotion, is that, you know, the primary problem that a woman has with an infant is why not throw it out a window? Because it's very annoying, right? I mean, it's there all the time. It's constant demand. It's absolutely constant demand, tremendous dependency. And so a woman has to be tilted towards mercy. That's how it looks to me.
Right.
And especially it's so important during especially the first year when children are so unbelievably vulnerable. And so I think it's very difficult for women to be merciful like that and to make the shift to encouraging disciplinarian. I think that's a very difficult thing for people to do simultaneously. Although, you know, people, I'm not saying that women are always only merciful and men are always only encouraging disciplinarians, but things do sort themselves out to some degree like that. And I think also the biochemical transformations that accompany pregnancy and childbirth and lactation also tilt a mother towards that as well. Right. She has to really love that little thing, right? It's number one, no matter what it demands. And then telling it what to do and making sure it's behaving properly, that's a whole different issue. Now, but the kids who lack fathers, I mean, first of all, they can find that to some degree in their friends. And that's often what fatherless boys do in particular. They go into gangs. And they generate the missing masculinity in the gang. Well, that's not so good because, like, what the hell do they know? Yeah. They don't know anything, right?
Nothing. Just as I thought. It appears that this structure was designed to be exclusively accessed by the sword's chosen one. But designs can always be worked around. At least I hope. How do I get inside? I need to activate it somehow. I thought I made it clear that I'm not in need of an escort. It seems I'm the only one with a mind of my own. I, the person in question, am fine, regardless of the king's orders. Return to the castle and tell that to my father, please. And stop following me!
They're just stupid kids, and they're like 15 years old, and their testosterone is pumping, and they're trying to get the hell away from their mother, which is what they're supposed to do. And they're not in the right position to exercise any authority over themselves. So that's not good. They can find it in education, they can find it in books, they can find it in movies, they can find it in sports heroes and so forth, because the image of the father is fragmented and distributed among the community. But it's very, very difficult to not have a father.
Right.
And you know, one of the things that we're doing in our society, which I think it's absolutely appalling, is that we're making the case that all families are equal. It's like, sorry, no, wrong. And there's no empirical data supporting that proposition, by the way. It's much better for kids to have two parents.
Okay.
Now, who those parents are, that's a whole different issue. But
Okay, and if I could just add one more thing. How would you answer that question to, let's say, a daughter who was raised without a father? Because she would obviously have different ways of finding those fragments of her missing father than, like, a boy would instead. Because obviously they're raised differently. At least they should have been.
Well, I think it's the same issue, you know. I mean, I think that another danger that emerges, and this is Freud's, of course, famous observation, is that, you know, if there's mom and child, or father and child, that relationship can get a little closer than it should. And then the lines get blurry and mixed. And I'm not saying that that happens to everyone, obviously, but it's still a danger that's inherent in the situation. They're thrust together too tightly without sufficient resources. And so the responsibility has to be distributed more. And like, I really do think that it's the sign of the degeneration of the society when single parenthood becomes anything approximating the norm. It's not a good idea. And part of the reason I believe that, and I think this has to do with the overwhelming selfishness of modern life, is that marriage isn't for the people who are married. It's for the children, obviously. And like, if you can't handle that, grow the hell up. No, I mean seriously.
Yeah. Okay.
Seriously. Once you have kids, it is not about you. Period. Now that doesn't mean it isn't about you at all. But that just seems so self-evident to me. I can't believe that anybody would even question it.
Oh, it's being questioned.
Oh yes, well I'm certainly aware of that. Yes, it's questioned. It's almost illegal to question it now. You know, illegal to make the set of propositions that I'm making. So that's the best I can do.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
This question is going in part to the first half of your lecture, but it's also something that's been on my mind listening to your lectures over the past few months. And that's when we talk about the psychological truth or significance of the Bible, to what extent does that psychological truth have to be embodied in specific historical events or people? And so, for instance, the thing that's sort of been bugging on my mind is there's a part that St. Paul's talking about in the New Testament somewhere in one of his letters, and he's talking about the resurrection. And he says, if it didn't happen, then this whole thing is just meaningless. The faith is meaningless. Like, for him, there had to be that embodiment of that historical person or event in that case.
Well, the best answer I have to that at the moment is that I'm really happy that I'm not at that point yet in this lecture series. You know, because there's a crucial issue there, and I don't know exactly what to make of it. And my approach at the moment, as I said, is to approach this as rationally as I possibly can, and I hope I know a hell of a lot more about what I'm doing by the time I get to that particular question. And I do have the beginnings of ways to answer that, but I'm not going to answer that at all right now because it's so bloody complicated. It would just burn me to a frazzle, and I'm already mostly burnt to a frazzle after that lecture, so I couldn't attempt to even start to sketch it out. I don't know. I mean, part of it is to be just rational about it, just to be rational about it. There is something about the idea that continual death and rebirth is a necessary precondition to proper human adaptation. Like every time you learn something new, that's important. Part of the stupid old you has to die. And sometimes that can be an awful lot of you. And in fact, it can be so much of you sometimes that you just die, right? You just can't handle it. And so there is a real idea that you have to identify with the part of yourself that transcends your current personality, that can constantly die and be reborn. Now, then I could say, well, that means that all of this is psychological and symbolic. And that's the simplest answer. But I'm not satisfied with that answer, even though I think it's coherent and complete. Because the world's a very weird place, and there are things about it that we don't understand. So I can't go any farther than that at the moment. So, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. I just recently watched one of your videos of you debating with transgendered protesters at U of T free speech rally in October. And one of the protesters said to you, which was in particular very chilling, was, why do you have the right to determine whether an individual is worthy of you using their pronouns? The scary thing to me is how common this type of view is among radical left-wing protesters on university campuses who feel they have the right to tell other people what they can think, what words they can use, and what speakers they can or cannot listen to. The even scarier part is that our government is creating legislation to back up their ideologies, which is evident through Bill C-16, M-103, and Bill 89. So my question is, what do you think the end game is in all of this? Because it seems every year...
We're in the process of finding that out. You know, and I'm sorry. Okay, we're in the process of finding that out. I think the end game that underlies all of that, in my estimation, is best summed up by Jacques Derrida's criticism of Western civilization. It's phallogocentric. Now, we've already talked about what the logos means, right? And so for Derrida, that was a sign of its utter, what would you call it? The utterly despicable, dominant nature of Western culture. Well, that's what animates the postmodernists. Now, they may not know that because an ideology gets fragmented across its adherents, and then it only acts as the coherent ideology when all those adherents come together in a mob. And then you see the animating spirit. So, I think that there's a battle going on that's a battle exactly at the level that Derrida described, and that's a theological battle with a philosophical implications, and out of those philosophical implications come political implications. But it's not primarily political, and it's not primarily philosophical. It's deeper than that. And the postmodernists are out, their criticism was designed to be fundamental. And it also emerged out of Marxism. And let's not forget that the Marxist criticism was not only fundamental, but just about resulted in the nuclear annihilation of the world. These are not trivial issues. And we're back in the same insane boat. And so, what do I think should be done about that? Well, I've thought about that way before any of this happened. And I think that what we should do about it is we should tell the truth. Because there isn't anything more powerful than that. And that's the right theological answer. Because the spoken truth brings good into being. Well, that's the phallogocentric idea. And I'm trying to revisit that to explain to people what it means and to see if they think that's a good idea. I mean, that's what we have to figure out. Is that an idea worth adhering to or not? The alternative is see, for the postmodernists, the world is that landscape of pyramids that I described. But there's no transcendent vision that's over above that. And all of those pyramids are equally valid, and it's a war of everyone against everyone. It's like the nightmare of Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, except that it's not individuals, it's groups. And everyone's a group. You're a group. You're whatever your group is. It's like, that's death, as far as I'm concerned. It's utterly reprehensible. And we better sort it out, because if we don't sort it out, we are bloody well going to pay for it. So,
thank you.
Hey, how's it going? I just thank you for doing this.
That's Bob and Doug McKenzie, right?
Yeah.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah.
I'm glad you caught that. Yeah.
So,
I did a Facebook poll.
Yeah.
Some people who are familiar with your work, and a question kind of rose to the top, like just right out of the blue. It was spectacular. And what it was, you didn't really touch it here, but you touched it. Integration.
Yep.
And the main question was, how does one go about that, especially in the modern world? You know, like we're usually sheltered from anything resembling that. You know, we don't engage like the unknown. We don't come into life or death situations. Most of us, unless we work as like an ambulance, you know.
Well,
how does
that's
one
one thing you can do. Well, that is one thing you can do. You know, is that you can search out experiences that put you there. That's you know, because, well, you can do that as a volunteer, for example. I mean, you can, one of the things I saw once, I was in Montreal. I was in this outdoor mall in Montreal on St. Hubert, and I saw this great big 17-year-old kid, you know, and he had a mohawk, and he was dressed in leather, and with, you know, studs, and like he was doing the modern barbarian thing, and he had it really down. And you know, he was standing in the corner with 2 pink shopping bags, eh? So I was looking at him, and I thought, you know, if someone offered him the opportunity to drop those goddamn sleeping bags, or shopping bags, and go fight with ISIS, he'd be there in a second.
Yeah.
Right, because what the hell is some monster like that doing standing on the corner of St. Hubert holding 2 pink shopping bags? So I mean, so some of it is that you need to find out where you can push, where you need to find out that edge that you can push yourself against, and it's going to be different for different people. But that's the call to adventure and heroism, and there are life and death situations everywhere around you if you want to involve yourself in them. Now, and sometimes that might be like to put yourself together to the degree that you can, say physically or spiritually or intellectually. It could be an intellectual battle, it could be a moral battle. Like, the frontier is everywhere. The frontier is just the edge between what you know and what you don't know. You want to put yourself on that damn edge and make yourself into something. And you can retreat into comfort in the modern world, and I think that is a problem. You know, I mean, I've noticed that it's one of the pathologies of wealth, I would say, because one of the problems with being relatively wealthy, if you're a parent, is that you cannot provide your children with necessity. And that's a big problem, because they need necessity to call them into being. And, you know, if you don't have a lot of material resources and your children ask you for something, you can say no because no is the answer. It's like, no, we can't do that. But if you can say yes, then it's really hard to say no, because then you're just arbitrary. Well, I don't know. It's like Kierkegaard said, you know, there will come a time when we have so much security and comfort that what we'll want more than anything else is deprivation and challenge. And I think that's particularly what young men want. Now, I think that's partly because young women, they're stuck with that anyways. Because they have to, it's the necessity of living in the world and the responsibility of infant care in particular. Like, that occupies them. Men have to do it voluntarily. Women now too, because of the birth control pill, but you know, that's 30 years ago. We hardly have to talk about that at all yet. So,
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. So I'm actually a Coptic Orthodox and Egyptian, so I found your talk today incredibly interesting. I've also taken a deep interest in the early church fathers, and as you were talking about hierarchies, I hearken back to St. Athanasius and the idea of theosis that you brought up last time, that God became man so that man can become like God. So I was thinking about this in terms of the hierarchies, and is that an example of how the top of the pyramid, the hierarchy, sort of gets inverted or descends to the bottom and brings it up and to the top, and that's sort of an attraction of Christianity? That's sort of made Christianity such a powerful idea. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, it's certainly one of the, it's certainly one of the things that made not just Christianity a powerful idea, because one of the things that happened, this was called the democratization of Osiris, if I remember correctly. And like what happened, see if I can answer this question. Is that going to work? I don't know if I can answer that question that way. The part of the attraction of Christianity, but this was something that emerged across time, was the notion that even if you were in a lowly position, that there was something about you that was akin to the divine. And now, you might say, well, that's just wish fulfillment. That's what Freud would say. That's what Marx would say, right? The opiate of the masses. I tweeted yesterday something I thought was pretty funny, which was that, like, religion was the opiate of the masses, but that Marxism was the methamphetamine of the masses. So I think the attraction was that it allowed people to recognize their intrinsic dignity. And one of the things I've been thinking about is the juxtaposition between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because what happens in Genesis 2 is that human beings collapse and fall, right? And then we're these fallen creatures that know evil. But in the beginning, in Genesis 1, it's really an optimistic story, because it says, well, we're the sorts of creatures that partake in the calling forth of being from chaos. And that's in our essential nature. And to some degree, if you juxtapose both of those, it's as if that's the entire biblical story rammed together in the first 2 chapters, which is partly why we're taking so long to get through this, by the way, is that to return to Genesis 1 is the antidote to Genesis 2. It's like to continue to act out the doctrine that you're made in God's image, and that means that you're capable of speaking good being into existence through truth. And that's also the antidote to the fall, which I think is actually the fundamental narrative message of the entire biblical structure, and I also think of Western civilization. So there's a nobility, and this is also why I think Nietzsche was fundamentally wrong in his criticism of Christianity, because he thought about it as slave morality, you know, the vengeance of the bottom against the top. That's more historical than theological. It's like it gives dignity. It illuminates the dignity of the human being. And it requires responsibility. So it's not just wish fulfillment. It's not Freudian wish fulfillment. The Freudian theory, which I thought about a lot, is not tenable in my estimation. It also doesn't account for the existence of hell. Because if it's only wish fulfillment, why bother with hell? I mean, it's a lot more. If you're really going to just fulfill a wish, it's like everybody gets to go to heaven no matter what they do. You don't have hell, which was, of course, something absolutely terrifying to medieval Christians, and then to plenty of people now, for that matter. So it's the nobility. It's the idea of the nobility that I think is deeply attractive to people. And that's all there is. I mean, what you have to fight against your worm-like, fragile, mortal existence is the possibility of transcending that with nobility of speech and act. That's what you have. And who can hear that without feeling ennobled by that? Now, you might say, well, you might shudder and say, well, I can't bear the responsibility. It's like, well, fair enough, man. You know, I mean, that's a reasonable criticism, but the consequence of not bearing the responsibility is that's hell, really. So,
thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I don't know if you're familiar with the works of Nassim Taleb.
I'm reasonably familiar with them.
So I think it's fair to say that he talks about the idea that people, and especially modern people, have a failure to recognize the unknown unknowns.
Yes.
The unknowns as such.
Yes, right. That's a good way of thinking about it. Can you move the mic up a bit so that people can hear you a little better? Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, do you think that failure might be in some way related to the way that modern people fail to relate to the idea of God? So, in the sense that, you know, people can't really grapple with the notion of God, right? Like, as much as you can give a rational argument for it, you can't feel God in the way that perhaps a more religious person or a more an older person might have felt God. Do you think that inability to recognize the unknown unknowns might play into that.
Well, so that seems to be related to this idea of the absence of necessity. So, something like that is that, because I think that what you're making a claim, maybe tell me if I've got it wrong, that if you're sheltered too much, then it also separates you from anything that's divine. I guess that might be right, because there's not enough intensity of experience in something like that. Is that part of the issue?
It might be more related to realizing the absolute infinitude of what you don't know, like the mystery and tremendous, like that kind of. If you believe that through statistical analysis you can get everything under control, and you genuinely believe that at some point you'll get it all under.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Well, that's also, I think, part of the danger of rationality that the Catholics have been implicitly warning against for forever, is that the rational mind tends to fall in love with its own production and then to worship them as absolutes, which is, I think, what Milton was trying to represent by his satanic figure in Paradise Lost. I think of that as like a precursor, a prophetic precursor to the emergence of totalitarian states in the modern world. And so, yeah, I think that you can believe that what you know is sufficient to banish permanently what you don't know. And I do think that that does, paradoxically, although you'd think that that would make you secure, it also does destroy your relationship with the spirit that might help you deal with what it is that you really don't know, with the unknown unknowns. So yeah, I mean, we don't know to what degree extreme experience is necessary to bring forth extreme experience, right? What do you have to be through before you encounter a religious revelation? Well, people might say, well, you can't because there's no such thing. It's like, well, don't be so sure about that. I mean, people have reported them throughout history, but they don't generally occur when you're, that's my favorite trope, when you're eating cheesies and playing, playing Mario Brothers, right? So that's the best I can do with that. Yeah. This has to be the last question.
All right, I'll make it quick.
Yeah.
Earlier, when you talked about criminality and creativity trends in men peaking at 14, it reminded me of something you said. I think it was Joe Rogan talking about SJWs and how they create their own chaos, talking about how adolescents have this drive to change the world. And I was wondering if those three, the criminality, creativity, drive to change the world, are linked, and if so, if they manifest differently in men and women, and if they kind of come from the same.
Well, I think they are linked, but I'm going to concentrate more on the second part of your question. So I'm going to ask you guys to think about something. So I talked to a friend of mine the other day. He's a very, very smart guy, and we've been talking about, well, all the sorts of things that we've been talking about tonight for a long time. And we were talking about the relative evolutionary roles of men and women. This is speculative, obviously. And because our research did indicate, it's tentative research so far, that the SJW sort of equality above all else philosophy is more prevalent among women. It's predicted by the personality factors that are more common among women. So agreeableness and high negative emotion. Primarily agreeableness. But in addition, it's also predicted by being female. And that's interesting because in most of the personality research that I've done, and as far as I know in the literature, more broadly speaking, most of the time you can get rid of the attitudinal differences between men and women, or at least reduce them by controlling for personality. So if you take a feminine man and a masculine woman, then the poles reverse. That didn't seem to be the case with political correctness. And so I've been thinking about that a lot because, well, men are bailing out of the humanities like mad, and pretty much out of the universities except for STEM. The women are moving in like mad, and they're also moving into the political sphere like mad. And this is new, right? We've never had this happen before, and we do not know what the significance of it is. It's only 50 years old. And so we were thinking about this, and so I don't know what you think about this proposition, but imagine that historically speaking, it's something like women were responsible for distribution and men were responsible for production. Something like that. And maybe that's only the case, really, in the tight confines of the immediate family, but that doesn't matter because that's most of the evolutionary landscape for human beings anyways. What the women did was make sure that everybody got enough. Okay, and that seems to me to be one of the things that's driving, at least in part, the SJW demand for equity and equality. It's like, let's make sure everybody has enough. It's like, I think fair enough, you know, I mean, you can't argue with that. But there's an antipathy between that and the reality of differential productivity, you know, because people really do differ in their productivity. So, all right, so to answer your question fully, I do think that the rebellious tendency of adolescence is associated both with that criminality spike, especially among men, and with creativity. Yes. I think that the SJW phenomena is different, and I think it is associated, at least in part, with the rise of women to political power. And we don't know what women are like when they have political power because they've never had it. I mean, there's been queens, obviously, and that sort of thing. There's been female authority figures, and females have wielded far more power historically than feminists generally like to admit. But this is a different thing. And we don't know what a truly female political philosophy would be like. But it might be, especially if it's not been well examined and it isn't very sophisticated conceptually. It could easily be, well, let's make sure things are distributed equally. Well, yeah, but sorry, that's just not going to fly.
Do you think in terms of the West with SJWs, when you talked about last lecture as well, creating chaos when there is none, otherwise it'd be static, do you think there would be any validity in saying that in a country like Canada where we're pretty gender equal, is there any merit to thinking SJWs are trying to create chaos even when there arguably is none on a mass level? Obviously there's still problems.
Why would they do that?
Otherwise, it would be static, and that drive.
Well,
it wouldn't. But I'm
so
just
I
wondering.
I read this quote once, and I don't remember who said it. It might have been Robert Heinlein, for crying out loud, science fiction author. That springs to mind, but it probably wasn't. And the proposition was that men tested ideas and that women tested men, and I kind of like that. There's something about that, you know. And now, obviously, it's an overgeneralization, but we also don't know to what degree women test men sheerly through provocation. It's a lot, because, like, if you want to test someone, you don't have a, like, little conversation with them. Like, you poke the hell out of them, and you say, okay, like, I'm going to, like, go after you and see where your weak spots are. And it seems to me that in this constant protest and use of shame and all of that goes along with this sort of radical movement towards egalitarianism, that there's a tremendous amount of provocation. And God, I'm going to say this too, even though I shouldn't. But you know, I don't believe this, but I'm trying to figure it out. You know, I thought it was absolutely comical when 50 Shades of Grey came out. Eh? I just thought that was just so insanely comical that at the same time, there's this massive political demand for, like, radical equality. And say, with regards to sexual behavior, and the fastest selling novel the world had ever seen was S&M Domination, right? It's like, oh, well, we know where the unconscious is going with that one, don't we? And sometimes I think, like, because one of the things that I've really tried to puzzle out, and it's not like I believe this, right? I'm just telling you where the edges of my thinking have been going, is that you have this crazy alliance between the feminists and the radical Islamists that I just do not get. It's like the feminists, it's like why they aren't protesting nonstop about Saudi Arabia is just completely beyond me. Like, I do not understand it in the least. And I wonder too, I just wonder bloody well, this is the Freud in me, is like, is there an attraction? You know, is there an attraction that's emerging among the female radicals for that totalitarian male dominance that they've chased out of the West? And I mean, that's a hell of a thing to think, but after all, I am psychoanalytically minded, and I do think things like that. Because, like, I just can see no rational reason for it. The only other rational reason is that, well, the West needs to fall, and so the enemy of my enemy is, exactly. Now, what is it? I got that wrong, but
the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yes, exactly.
And that's why Islamists tend to vote liberal as well.
Yes, well, so that could be the case, but I'm not going to shake my suspicion about this unconscious balancing, because as the demand for egalitarianism and the eradication of masculinity accelerates, there's going to be a longing in the unconscious for the precise opposite, for of that, right? The more you scream for equality, the more your unconscious is going to admire dominance. And so, well, that's how you think if you're psychoanalytically minded. And you know, I'm a great admirer of Freud. He knew a hell of a lot more than people like to think. And so it's partly why everyone still hates him, even though it's been 100 years since he's, you know, really been around. So, all right, we should stop. Hello, everyone. So hopefully we're going to get past Genesis 1 today. That's the theory. So I finished my new book yesterday. Yeah, so that's taken about 3 years of writing. It's quite a long time to write something. So yeah, it's done, except for the mopping up, you know, copy editing and that sort of thing. So hopefully it's as good as I can make it. I don't know if it's any good, but it's as good as I can make it anyways. All right, so this is the stories that I'm going to tell you tonight. I've been thinking about, well, like the ones last week for that matter, for a very long period of time, but I think these even longer. And one of the things that I just do not understand, I cannot fathom this. I cannot understand how there can be so much information in such tiny little stories, especially the story of Cain and Abel. That story just, every time I read it, it just flattens me because it's only like a paragraph long. There's just nothing to it, you know? And I think about it, 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 and every time I think about it, another layer comes out from underneath it, and another layer comes out from underneath it, and I can't figure that out. Like, you know, the rational approach that I've been describing to you is predicated on the idea that these stories have somehow encapsulated wisdom that we generated interpersonally and behaviorally, and then an image over very vast stretches of time, and then condensed it into very, very dense, articulated words that are then further refined by the act of being remembered and transmitted and remembered and transmitted and remembered and transmitted over vast stretches of time. And that's a pretty good argument. I'm willing to go with it, but it still never ceases to amaze me how much information such tiny little passages can contain. So we'll take that apart today. And I think it's especially true with the story of Cain and Abel, because it works on the individual level, and it works on the familial level, and it works on the political level, and it works at the level of warfare, and it works at the level of economics, and that's a lot for a little tiny one-paragraph story to cover, man. Now, you know, you could object, well, if these stories, you never know what you're reading into it and what's in the story, right? That's part of, let's call it the postmodern dilemma, and fair enough. And there's really no answer to that, any more than there is an answer to how do you know your interpretation of the world is, well, let's not say correct, but sufficient. There's some answer to that. It's sufficient in if you can act it out in the world and other people don't object too much and you don't die and nature doesn't take a bite out of you any more often than necessary. You know, those are the constraints within which we live. So you have some way of determining whether your interpretation is at least functionally successful, and that's not trivial. And I guess you can say the same thing to the interpretations that might be laid out on these stories, and at the moment that's probably good enough. Hopefully you find the interpretations functionally significant at multiple levels. And I also think the chance of managing that by chance is very, very small, you know, to be able to pull off an interpretation of a story that works at multiple levels simultaneously. You think with each level that it applies, the chances that you've stumbled across something by chance have to be decreasing, right? There's a technical term for that in psychology. It's called something like multi-method, multi-trait method of determining whether or not something is accurate. And the idea is the more ways that you can measure it and get the same result, the more confident you can be that you're not just deluding yourself with your a priori hypothesis, you know, that there's actually something out there So I guess that's another part of this method, is that it's also a method that I use in my speaking, I think. I don't try to tell people anything that isn't personally relevant, because you should know why you are being taught something, right? You should know what the fact is good for, and then it should be good for you personally, at least in some sense, and then if you act it out in the world, it should be good for your family, and maybe should have some significance for the broader community. And I think that's what meaning means, and I don't really see the utility in being taught things that aren't meaningful, facts that aren't meaningful, because there's an infinite number of facts, and there's no way you're going to remember all of them. They have to have the aspect of tools, essentially, something like that, because we are tool-using creatures. Well, these stories have that aspect. As far as I can tell, there's nothing. There's no doubt about that. So here's the stories in Genesis 2, very famous stories, obviously. Virtually everybody who's even vaguely versed in Western, roughly speaking, Western culture knows these stories. And that's something that's interesting too, that stories can be so foundational that everybody shares them. I mean, you can say the same thing about a fairly large handful of fairy tales as well, or you could at least until recently. But the fact that stories are foundational, I think, also means that they have to be given a kind of, well, even if you don't give them any respect, you have to at least treat them as remarkable curiosities. So why those stories, and why did they stick around, and why does everybody know them? It's not self-evident by any stretch of the imagination, and you can use explanations. You can use the Freudian explanation. Freud sort of thought that the Judeo-Christian was predicated on the idea that the figure of the father, the familial father, was expanded up into cosmic dimensions so that mankind existed in the same relationship to the cosmic father. Let's say that an infant or a small child existed in relationship to his or her own father. And that's a reasonable critique, I would say, to some degree, but it does, and this was purposeful, it does imply, more than imply in Freud's case, that people who adopt a religious belief that has a personified figure as at its apex are essentially acting out the role of dependent children. And I thought about that critique for a long time, and believe me, that's been a powerful critique. One of the best books I ever read, called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, I think took that line of argumentation. It developed it as well as any book I've ever seen argue it. Becker tried to bring closure to Freudian psychoanalysis on religion, and he did a pretty wicked job of it. Like, I think the book is seriously flawed and wrong, but it's really a great book. Like, some books are wrong in really good ways, right? They make a powerful, powerful argument. They really take it to its extreme. I think Becker missed the point, and he missed it in the same way that Freud missed Jung's point, and Becker, who wrote this book on the psychology, the psychoanalysis of religion, never referred to Jung except very briefly in the introduction, and I think that was a major mistake. But Becker took the argument that the hypothesis of God is nothing but an attempt by human beings to recreate a quasi-infantile state of dependency and to be able to rely on an all-knowing father and to thereby recover the comfort, perhaps, that we experienced when we were young and had a hypothetically all-knowing father, for those of us who were lucky to have someone who vaguely resembled that. But the more I thought about that, the more that struck me as quite implausible across time. Charles Taylor, I think it was Charles Taylor, wrote an interesting book called The Origins of the Modern Self. He's a McGill philosopher, and I wouldn't necessarily call him a friend of classic religion, but it doesn't matter. He made a very interesting point about Christianity in particular. He said, well, if you're going to invent a religion that offered you nothing but infantile comfort, why in the world would you bother with conceptualizing hell? That just seems like an unnecessary detail to add to the whole story, right? If it's all about comfort, why would you hypothesize that the consequence of serious error was eternal torment? That doesn't really sound very... It isn't the sort of thing that is likely to make you feel comfortable. James Joyce, when he wrote about that, said he had terrible nightmares when he was a child because of the hellfire sermons the Jesuits used to spout spew forth, let's say, and he wrote down what he remembered of them, and they were pretty hair-raising. I think in James Joyce's book, I think it was Portrait of the Artist of a Young Man, he talked about the Jesuits telling him that hell was like a prison with walls that were 7 miles thick that was always in darkness and consumed by fire, and that the people who were trapped there were continually burnt by this dark fire that gave new light, which also simultaneously rejuvenated their flesh so that it could be burnt off eternally. In case you were wondering how it was going to be burnt off eternally, that's apparently the process. It's not easy for me to see that as an infantile wish fulfillment, I'm afraid. Now, you could be a cynic about it, and Elaine Pagels, who wrote a book on the devil, was cynical about it in this manner. She thought that the Christians, so to speak, invented hell as a place to put their enemies. And, you know, yeah, fair enough, but no, that's not accurate, really, although it's convenient to have a place to put your enemies. Charles Taylor did point out, for example, that the modern terror of loss of self, let's say the existential loss of self and loss of meaning, was perhaps roughly paralleled by the medieval terror of hell, you know, in terms of existential intensity. And so hell wasn't merely a place where those people that you didn't care for would end up. It was the place where you were going to go if you didn't walk the line properly. And so I don't think Freud's critique really holds water in the final analysis. And then Marx's critique, of course, was that religion was the opiate of the masses, and he made an argument that was similar to Freud's, although somewhat earlier, and based upon the presupposition that religious beliefs were stories told to the gullible masses in order to keep them pacified and happy while their corporate overlords, for lack of a better purpose, continued to exploit them and weaken them. And, you know, I find the critique of human institutions as driven entirely by power very, let's say, questionable to say the least. And of course, every human institution is corrupt by, for one reason or another, and it's also corrupt specifically by such things as deception and arrogance and the demand for unearned power. And the same thing, of course, can be applied to religious systems, but that doesn't mean that they are in some special way characteristic of those faults. And maybe you think they are, and you know, maybe you can make a case for it, but it's not prima facie, I think that's how you say that, evident that also is a particularly useful criticism. I don't buy it. I think that's far too cynical. I think that the people who wrote these stories, first of all, what are you going to do? You're going to run a bloody conspiracy for 3,000 years successfully? It's like, good luck with that. You can't run a conspiracy for 15 minutes without somebody ratting you out. You know, it's impossible. So whatever's at the basis of the construction, not only of these stories, but of the dogmatic structures that emerged from them, I think that it's a terrible mistake to reduce them to unidimensional explanations. In fact, I generally think that reducing any complex human behavior to a unidimensional explanation is often the sign of a seriously limited thinker. And, you know, I say that with some caution because Freud did do that with religion, at least to some degree, and Freud was a serious thinker. And Marx, I suppose, was a serious thinker too, even though, well, yeah, he's someone if you have any sense, Marx just leaves you speechless. So anyway, so that's all to say that I don't think there's any simple explanation for how these stories have the power that they have. I really don't. I don't think you can reduce it to political conspiracy, that's for sure. I don't think you can reduce it to psychological infantilism. I think you can make a case, like I have, that they are repositories of the collective wisdom of the human race. I had an interesting letter this week from someone. I get a lot of interesting letters. I think I'm going to make an archive out of them and put them on the web at some point, with people's permission, obviously. And he said that he'd been following my lectures and noted that I'd been making what we might describe as a quasi-biological or evolutionary case for the emergence of the information that the stories contain. And he said, well, how do you know that someone from a different religious tradition, or speaking of a different religious tradition, couldn't do exactly the same thing? And I thought, well, first of all, to some degree they could, because there is overlap. Like, I've talked to you a little bit about Taoism, for example, and the Taoist view of being as, you know, the eternal balance between chaos and order. One thing I didn't tell you, I don't think about that, and I don't know if you know this, but there's a neuropsychologist named Elkonin Goldberg, who was a student of Alexander Luria, and Luria was, I think, the greatest neuropsychologist of the 20th century. He was a Russian, and he was one of the first people to really determine, in large part, the function of the frontal cortex, which was quite a mystery for a very long period of time. And Goldberg, you know how we have two hemispheres, right? We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and people often think of the left for right-handed people, right-handed males more particularly, because women are more neurologically diffuse. It's one of the things that makes them more robust to head injury, for example. And maybe men are less diffuse and somewhat more specialized, which makes them a bit more specialized, but a little more subject to damage. Anyways, we have two hemispheres, left and the right, and no one exactly knows why. And we know that they house quasi-independent consciousnesses, because if you divide the corpus callosum that unites them, which was done in cases of intractable epilepsy, for example, that each hemisphere is capable of developing its own consciousness to some degree. The right generally non-verbal and the left verbal. And so there has been this idea that the left is a verbal hemisphere and the right is a non-verbal hemisphere. But that can't be right, because of course animals don't talk and they have a bifurcated hemisphere. So if it's right, it's not causally right. Now Goldberg hypothesized instead that the hemispheres were specialized for routinization and non-routinization, or for novelty and familiarity, or for chaos and order. So that's pretty damn cool. When I ran across that, I also thought about that as a signal of what we call multi-method, multi-trait construct validation, because I'd never thought of the hemispheres as operating that way, and Goldberg came up with this in a historical pathway that was entirely independent from any mythologically inspired thinking, completely independent. In fact, it was motivated more by materialist Russian neuropsychology, which was materialist for political reasons and also for scientific reasons. But the idea is that we have one hemisphere that reacts very rapidly to things we don't know, and it's more imaginative and diffuse, and it's associated more with negative emotion, because negative emotion is what you should feel immediately when you encounter something you don't understand. Because it's a form of thinking, right? Negative emotion, it's like, I'm somewhere where things aren't what they should be. The right hemisphere does that, generates images very rapidly to help you figure out what might be there. And then the left hemisphere takes that and develops it into something that's more articulated and algorithmic and fully understood. And so then there's this dynamic balance between the right and the left hemisphere, where the left tries to impose order on the world. That's Ramachandran, who's a neurologist in California, a very famous neurologist, who also developed a theory like Goldberg's, who said that the left hemisphere imposes routinized order on the world, and the right hemisphere generates novelty and reacts to novelty and generates novel hypotheses. And he thought, and there is some good evidence for this, that's what's happening during the dream is that information is moved from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere in small doses, basically, so that the novel revelations of the right hemisphere don't demolish the algorithmic structures that the left hemisphere has so carefully put together. So, and I like that theory too, because it also does help justify the hypothesis that I've been laying out for you, which is that, you know, there's part of us that extends ourselves out into the world and tries to understand what we don't know, and that